Hello everybody. Today I would like to cover weaving math because there's a lot of math in weaving, and reading a draft, and then I will show you how that draft relates to actually threading the heddles, because that's where the draft gets real important, the heddles and the treadles. So all right, let's start with the math. This is my math worksheet. I have started using an Excel spreadsheet that I found. I will attempt to find a link to it so that I can put it in the notes. I don't know that I remember exactly where I came across it, but I'll do a search and I'll find it and put it in the notes. All right, the very first thing you always calculate when you are planning your weaving project is your warp. And you start with the width, because that's kind of the first thing you need to know, is how wide does it need to be on the loom. So you have to decide, okay, what do I want the final width to be? And in this case, I decided on 20 inches. Oh, and weaving math is almost always done in inches. Don't ask me why, it just is. And then you have to account for take-up, and that's how much it shrinks in width on the loom as you run the weft, and your shrinkage, which is what happens when you finish your product, because you never, ever, ever take something off the loom and don't wet finish it. Unlike knitting, you cannot get away without finishing your weaving. It has to be done. So in this case, I went with 10% on both. A lot of times I will do 10% on the take-up and 15% on shrinkage, or 15% on both, because I really want to make sure that I'm accounting for all the possibilities of shrinkage and that sort of thing. So the width on the loom, the 20 inches plus the 2 inches and 2 inches of take-up and shrinkage means it needs to be 24 inches on the loom. Then you decide how many ends per inch, and that's based on your yarn, your type of weave structure, and I'm still learning how different weave structures affect that, and how loose of a weave do you want it to be when it's actually finished. In the case of some art pieces, you might want a very loose open weave, or some lace weaves, you might want it to be fairly open. But in this case, I went with a balanced weave, and that meant that it would be 12 ends per inch for this particular linen yarn. So you multiply your width by the ends per inch, and that gives you the total number of warp ends. Well, then you have to account for your patterning. So what does your draft require in terms of the number of ends? And that's figured down here. So the ends per repeat was 26. The number of repeats to get the approximate width that I wanted, the 24 inches, was 11. Ends in the final edge, and that means do you need to add on floating salvages? Do you need to create an edge stitch? So the last pattern I had, I should have added end stitches that allowed for the unbalanced shift in the shed. But I didn't do that. I made that mistake. And then, so how many are the total ends that you need? And compare that to the ends that you calculated up here, and this is 2 ends short. So you really need only 286 ends. I added 3 ends, and I think it was because the edge on the left side was wider than the edge on the right side. I should have wound 289 threads. I actually wound, according to my current count, 271. I'll know once I've got it fully threaded through the heddles if I really did make that mistake or if I just counted wrong somewhere. So I may be quite a bit short on the number of ends, and I may have to figure out a way to either adjust the pattern or add warp ends. I can add warp ends the same way I took warp ends out last time, but instead of having them wound around the warp beam and then hung over the back with a weight, I will weight them, run them through the heddles in the reed, and they'll just run forward with a weight. And so periodically I'll have to go and lengthen the amount of warp released from the weight so that they can move freely. So that's kind of where I'm at with the width of my warp. Now I have the length of my warp to calculate. So how long is each item going to be, including a hem? And so a hem would be allowing for a little bit of tabby or plain weave to fold over and sew down so that it's a nice hem versus having fringe. And since these are towels, I do want, in fact, to have a hem. So my end length is 31 inches. So that allows a 1/2 inch hem on both ends. My shrinkage, again, is at 10%. I probably should have gone 15 because this is linen, but we'll see. So my length to weave is 34.1 inches. Obviously, I'm going to round that to 34. How much do I want to put between articles? In other words, how many of these towels do I plan on weaving and what space do I want to leave between them? I allowed 1 inch. I may cut that down to 1/2 inch since I'm hemming these anyway. Take up, again, allowing for this total and the total length of the article. So actually your take up should be up here before this length to weave. It's in the wrong place on this particular sheet, and I have on later sheets moved things. So total length of the article, how many articles, and so how much warp length do I need for actual weaving? So that was 77 inches. That accounts for the take up and the shrinkage for 2 items plus the inch in between for a total of 77 inches. Then I've calculated for loom waist. Now I did a little research and tried to come up with an idea of what my loom waist might be, and it was 24 inches that I calculated. I have learned off the first item that I took that it might be more like 30 inches. So I'm going to be adding 30 inches to my new weaves. Obviously, I'd already wound this warp. There was nothing I could do about it. And then, of course, how much do I want for a sample at the beginning? And the sample is testing to make sure you've got all your heddles threaded correctly. It gives you a sample that you can tuck into the file with this paper to show how it actually worked out. I did not have a sample for the scarf. Good thing I didn't, because I ended up a little shy on my length, probably because of the loom waist issue. But I've allowed for a 5-inch sample. Now, if my sample's going really well, like my heddles are all threaded correctly, I don't have any issues with the sheds, then I probably won't do a full 5 inches. I might do 2 or 3 because I don't need a real big sample to put in here. So my total warp length is now 106 inches. So now I've divide that by 36 for yards. I round that off and it becomes 3 yards per end. So I now need 289 ends at 3 yards length each. This math down here tells you how many yards you need to purchase if you're purchasing yarn, or how many yards you need to make sure you have if you're using from stash. If you're purchasing, you probably want to figure your yards per pound so that you know your weight of what you're buying. Most weaving yarns are sold in per pound cost. They might not be a full pound on the cone, but they always include the yards per pound so that you can compare and say, okay, this yarn is giving me the same yards per pound as that yarn, so I can substitute. So that's a real helpful thing to know. But since I pulled this from stash, I did not worry about that. Same thing with weft. It's how many shots or picks per inch. How many times are you going to throw the shuttle every inch? I hope I didn't hit that microphone. I apologize if I did. And then you multiply the shots per inch or picks per inch by the warp width and by the warp length. Give yourself a 15% or so shrinkage and that sort of thing. Divide by 36 to give you the number of yards you need for weft. Again, you would calculate the yards per pound and how many pounds you need. So this total here would give you how much yarn you need to buy total of your two, if you're buying the same yarn for warp and weft. So that's the basic math that tells you how to wind your warp, approximately how much yarn you need for weft. Obviously you want to account for any errors, that sort of thing, but this is pretty accurate. Okay, now let's take a look at the draft, and I'm going to show you my, that's my lead yarn, or my guide yarn for when I was winding the warp. And I've kept this because it's at 3 yards. And if I have another item that comes up at 3 yards, or if I want to redo this pattern, I have my guide yarn all set. All right, this is a draft. And I'm going to show you the basics here, but then I'm going to move over to the place where I created this draft and printed it from to show you the application that I use that helps me track everything. And we'll be able to get into a couple of little pieces of detail since at that point as well. All right, so this is your draft. This area here is called your drawdown. That is how your pattern will look using this threading and this treadling. This printout has been done as a lift plan because I have to account for every shaft that needs to be lifted to create my shed. If you are doing a floor loom with treadles, then you would use a tie-up plan that would show you how to tie up each shaft to the treadles so that you could create this same picture. And I'll show you more of that when I get into the application. So the first thing you do is you figure out what is your weave going to look like and what do you have to do to thread it through the heddles. This is your threading. So this is the number of repeats. This is where you get that number of warps per repeat, 26. And in this case, it's an 8 shaft pattern. It's got all 8 shafts listed. And it tells you which shaft each thread needs to go through. So 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. That is exactly how I have threaded the heddles that I've got threaded already. And I'll show you those in a little bit. This is your lift plan on this side, and it shows me which shafts need to be lifted for each shed. So this first one, I need to lift 1, 2, 3, 5, and 7. And then I need to drop 1, lift 4, dropped 5, lift 6, drop 7, lift 8 for the second. So I'm going to lift those shafts to create the shed for each pick. And then you can put approximate colors of the yarn you're using into your draft. This is here, this is the warp, and this is the weft, to get an idea of what those yarns are going to look like. Now, they're not going to be exact. There's no way to get exact. And in the case of the scarf, one of the problems is you can't do a variegated yarn. So you end up either choosing different colors and kind of seeing how it looks in the different colors, which I have done with something just to play with it. Or you just leave it all one solid color and know that it's going to look a little different. Okay, so that's the draft. I have printed this not to follow, but to just keep a record of it. Okay, and it's got the name of the draft and everything here in my application, so I can go back and find it again in the future. All right, so let's bring out my iPad and get it running. And here's my draft in the application. So you can see the exact same things here. I'm going to show you that I can see the entire, I can see multiple repeats so that I can get a better idea of what it's going to look like. So that little piece up there is not exactly what I go off of. This is what I go off of. This is what says, oh, yep, this will work. Okay. And I can reduce that down to what I printed. Okay. Or make it full again. I can tell this pattern is a treadle instead of a lift plan, and that you can see how it changes. This becomes your treadle numbers, and this is the shafts that need to be assigned to each treadle or tied to each treadle so that you get the correct shed to make each of these lines. Okay, but mine is, of course, as a lift plan because I don't have treadles. I have levers. Okay. You can also change it from a rising shed to a lowering shed. I think that relates to different types of looms. I'm not sure if counter marsh looms sometimes have a lowering shed. And that affects how the weave looks on the top versus on the bottom. Because when you turn a weave over, it will look different. Let's go back in here just for a moment. A sinking shed. You see, now your weft is what creates the pattern instead of your warp. So what you see is your weaving changes a little bit. Okay, so that's the difference between a rising shed and a sinking shed. But mine is a rising shed, so that's the lift plan. Okay, and here's how I can change colors. So if I had a different color weft that I wanted to use, I could select it and start putting in different shots to make it look different. Okay, so that's how coloring can work. I can do the same thing with my warp. Let's use the same color and just do every other one just to see what happens. And you'll see that changes the pattern rather drastically. Okay? So this is where I track, and I'll go back later and fix those colors before I do this. I track both my threading and my treadling or my lifting here. So let's look at tracking threading because that's what I'm currently doing. This is where I'm at, this red square. And this green line kind of marks a halfway point really doesn't need to be there, but I accidentally put it there, so it's kind of stuck. So this will tell me what thread goes through each shaft, which heddle on the, which shaft's heddle, and where I'm at in the pattern. And when I start the tracking, I then know that the next 4 that I need to pull are on shaft 4, 5, 6, and 7. The last 4 should have been 2, 1, 2, 3. So I will look before I start, make sure that the last 4 threads that I've got done go 2, 1, 2, 3, and then I'll know I'm still on the correct spot. When it comes to following the treadling, okay, I have to save it first because I changed some things. Track the treadling. Okay, save. Thank you. All right, there is my lift plan. So that's the first pick. That's the shafts that need to be lifted. And when I start tracking, each time I finish throwing, I will then tap this. It will tell me which shafts to lift, to change to, and then I will beat after I've changed the shafts. It's better to beat once you've changed because that will affect the amount of warp pulled in, and it helps keep your edges a little better. Sometimes people beat first and then change and then beat again. I tend to not do that. Okay, so that's the basics of using a draft, reading a draft. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment. If you have any comments on how I do this, if you've got any suggestions for changes or what have you, please feel free. I am going to add in a little picture of just what I've been doing and how the threading is going on this particular draft. And that will be it for today. Thank you.